So you inherited a piece of land. Now what do you do with it? Hey guys, it's Brad from probateresource.com. At Probate Resource, we're a real estate solutions company specializing in the world of probate and inheritance properties. We're based out of Metro Atlanta, but we don't just buy houses here in Georgia. We actually buy houses all over the place. And like I said, we specialize in probate and inheritance. Today, I want to talk about inheriting a piece of land and what do you do with it? A lot of times people inherit a piece of land and they decide to keep it in the family, right? Maybe it's a piece of land that's been in the family for a long time. But sometimes they do sell land that's been in the family for a long time. A great example of that is actually the property that my personal house is on. The family that I bought that from, that piece of land has been in their family since the land lottery in the 1800s. It's been in their family for a long, long time. Sometimes families will sell off bits and pieces of the land. For example, like my own personal house that I just talked about. This family, over the years, once upon a time owned a very, very large amount of land, but slowly over time they've sold off bits and pieces, and now the kids are in their 60s and basically retiring, and some of them actually, one of them who lives 2 doors down from me, he has his piece of property up for sale, and they want to move up to the mountains and just kind of retire up in the mountains and live away. This area's got a little too congested for them, although it's really not that congested. But, you know, sometimes things change, and sometimes people feel bad about selling their family land. But the reality is not everyone's needs are the same. And a great example of that is right behind my property where I live, there is an 18-acre parcel that we had actually made an offer to the estate that owned it. Really, I say estate, it was a gentleman. He was the sole heir, and he was the administrator or the executor of the estate. And he inherited it from his dad, and his sister's since passed away. So really, it was just his. And he was selling this property. We made him an offer. Me and my business partner kind of made him an offer to buy it, and we were going to kind of split it up into basically like 3-acre lots and sell them as estate lots. We were going to put a small little street in with a cul-de-sac. The way the property was shaped is actually perfect. You just put like maybe a 300-foot long little street with a cul-de-sac at the end, and then you just sort of fan the lots out around it and make like a little minor subdivision. We were planning on doing that, but anyways, he had ended up getting an offer from another developer for significantly more than what we offered him. Ironically, that other developer now has been sitting on this property, hasn't done anything with it in probably 18 months. He's been butting heads with the county about it. He's had to revise his plan a bunch of different times, and he even tried to sell the property for basically what he paid for it. So wasn't a really good investment on his part because he paid too much money for it, but good for the seller, good for the estate. They made more money than we offered them. I think the other offer came in about $400,000 more than what we had offered. Great for the seller, good for him. Why did the seller sell that property? Well, he had his own property. He lived about 4 miles down the road from here, and he had like 15 acres. That was, I talked to him one day. I went out there and met with him and talked to him out in the driveway. And he's like, I already have land of my own. I have a little mini farm. I have some horses, some goats, chickens, whatever. I have 15 acres. It's 4 miles away. It's not very far from here. And he's like, I don't really need this property here. And he said, my kids don't want it. My one son lives in, Dallas, Texas, and my daughter lives in, out west somewhere. And he's like, we're not going to do anything with this land. And he's like, I'd rather sell this land to somebody who's going to do something cool with it. And he was actually very selective about who's going to sell it to, because he wanted to sell it to somebody who's going to not turn it into some big, like, high density subdivision, whatever. The reality is they couldn't have even done that anyways, because there's no sewer access anywhere nearby that would even make it remotely feasible to build a big development there. High density just won't happen. So it's going to be like a minor subdivision, houses on large estate lots, on septic systems. There is county water there, but they would all be on septic. So you want to sell this piece of land, right? How much do you sell it for? Well, I can tell you, being in real estate for a number of years, in land, more than any other sector of real estate, sellers tend to way overvalue their land. And I'm not just saying this from an investor developer perspective, right? I want everything for a good deal. I mean, I want good deals on stuff, right? If the numbers don't make sense, I don't buy it. But sellers make a huge mistake and think their land is worth so much more than it really is. And if you want to check that out, do this little experiment. Go drive around and look for old faded land for sale signs. And I guarantee once you start looking, you will notice a ton of them. You will notice a lot of them all over the place. All of these properties that have been for sale for years and years and years, and they haven't sold yet. And why is that? It's because the seller has grossly overpriced the property, and or maybe they don't really want to sell and they're just waiting for some crazy offer, which is a weird strategy in my opinion, but hey, more power to them, right? So anyways, sellers overprice their land. So if you really want to sell this land that you've inherited, you need to make sure that you're consulting. If you don't know what it's worth, you need to get with someone who can tell you what it's worth. And who can tell you what it's worth? Well, number one, a builder or developer can definitely tell you what it's worth because they're actually the ones doing the work to develop and build this property. They have the most experience in this realm, someone such as myself. Next in line, I would say, would be a real estate agent who has experience and history selling the land, not just listing the land, but selling the land in your specific area. You need to find someone who actually has experience selling land. So you need to look at sold properties and see who the listing agent was that listed it. And more than likely, they're going to have some experience as to pricing your land appropriately for sale. And listen to what they have to say. They're professionals. They do this day in and day out. I can't tell you how many times I've seen where sellers have said, oh, my agent is stupid and, this land's worth $1 million and we're going to list it for $1 million. Or we'll just go find another agent that'll list it for $1 million for us. And guess what happens? They list it with the other real estate agent and the land sits and it sits and it sits and it sits and it doesn't sell. Turns out that their first real estate agent really wasn't an idiot. They were the idiot because they didn't really know how to properly price land and they thought it was worth way more than it was. Also, let's get into what creates value in land. Every deal we look at the highest and best use of that land. What can we do with that land? And what is the highest and best use of that property given the surroundings, the zoning, obviously the cost of construction, that sort of thing. What can we do with this land? And I have looked at a lot of properties that were, in my opinion, completely worthless. Or they were worthless from the standpoint that they were completely cost prohibitive as to being able to do anything with it. A great example of that would be like a property that has like a ton of rock in it. The geology of it, there's probably a ton of rock. It's going to cost you a fortune to blast all of that rock out of that building site to make it buildable. That's not as common around here in Georgia, but there's definitely parts of the country and certain parts everywhere where rock is a major issue, especially up in the Northeast. They have ledge, which is like granite, basically, and you got to bust through this granite, and it's very, very cost prohibitive to develop that because you've got to blast it, you've got to chip it, it's not easy, right, to make a buildable site. That's a big cost. What are some other things that affect the value of land? Accessibility, for one. Does your land have an easement to it? Do you have direct road frontage? Is there even a road on the land? What is the accessibility to access that land? The less accessible the land is, the less it's worth, okay? The more accessible the land is, the more it's worth. What's another thing? Access to utilities. Is there access to power, water, internet, sewer? Sewer's not always, necessary because in some cases you can just put septic system. Some of you that are watching this video that maybe live in the city and you've never even heard of a septic system. I live kind of out in the country a little bit. Septic's perfectly normal. My house is on septic. Every house the last 2 houses I've lived in have had septic systems. Like there's nothing wrong with the septic system. It's properly designed. It'll last you decades and decades and decades and decades. It's fine. Just pump it every few years, about every 5 years. I pump my systems every 5 years. It costs between $350 and $400 to have somebody come pump the system out and, just keep it healthy and it will last for a long, long, long time. So anyways, access to utilities. Also, one big expense is, there might be power, But if your lot's like way back off the road, it's very expensive to run electricity all the way back there. Costs a lot of money, tens of thousands of dollars to run electricity back there. So your potential buyer of that land is going to look at that and see, hey, it's going to cost me 50 grand to have the power company run power back to the property. Because the power company, typically they will charge you, they typically have like a minimum distance. They'll go a certain amount of feet, but if you're beyond that, I think it's like under 100 feet, they'll basically, or at least around here, if it's under 100-foot run from the transformer or the pole or wherever to your house, they'll typically install the power for free, or maybe charge you a very nominal amount, a few $100 or something. But if you go beyond that point, it can cost a lot more money. For example, my house sits about 150 feet off of the road. So I had to pay an additional, I think it was like $800 to have them run power to my house. Plus I wanted 400 amps of power, so they had to run 2 power cables from the transformer to my house so that I could have 400 amps of service. So that costs money. Running water lines is the same deal. Also, if you have to bury them, I mentioned the geology, right? If you're going to have to bust through a bunch of rock to run water lines or whatever, especially water lines because they have to be run below grade, well, that's going to be a cost right there. What's another thing that affects cost? Well, floodplains. Is your property in a floodplain? If you're not sure about that, you can actually go online. FEMA has flood maps published for all the states everywhere where you can actually access and see whether your property sits in a flood zone. You need to worry about the major flood zones, the 100-year flood zones, like Zone A, Zone AE. There's also Zone X. If you're like in a coastal place, I think it's Zone X is what you have to worry about. I'm not on the coast, but we deal with A and AE around here. Those are the bad ones, right? And if you have a property that's in one of those zones, requires mandatory flood insurance. Flood insurance is not cheap. It's expensive. So your potential buyer is going to look at that and say, hey, also, if you have a property that's predominantly floodplain, it's going to be very difficult to even build anything on it, or very cost prohibitive to build anything on it. In fact, the county might not even issue you permits to build anything on it, or not you or anyone else. For example, there was a property that me and a business partner of mine, deal we did many years ago. It was back in, I think it was 2018 or something. It was many years ago. This particular property, in 2013, they redrew the flood maps. This house was in Decatur, Georgia. It was a 1960s Decatur ranch. If you've driven through Decatur, it's just full of 1960s brick ranches. They're everywhere. That's just what was built in Decatur. And anyways, in this case, we call it a Decatur brick ranch, which they are, right? And the flood zone, when the maps were redrawn in 2013 after the 2009 floods we had here in Atlanta, they redrew the flood zone, and the flood zone basically touched the corner of this house. So like a 3-foot or 4-foot triangle of one corner of the house was in the flood zone. So what did that mean? Well, we wanted to remodel this house. We wanted to do an addition on it. Ironically, the addition was on the opposite side of the house from the flood zone, but the county gave us a lot of crap about doing this addition because the property was in a flood zone. So we ended up having to go get an elevation survey done, which tells you like how high above sea level you are and all that. And we basically gave them a certificate and said, hey, look, yes, the FEMA flood maps show that it's in the flood zone, but the reality is like the flood zone doesn't technically actually touch the house because the real elevation of the house is actually here versus what FEMA's maps were. And we were finally able to get some permits on the place and do an addition. Now, because the lot was partially in the flood zone, the buyers of the house, actually, we ended up keeping that as a rental property, but the buyers would have had to get flood insurance. Although because of the elevation survey we got, it showed that the house is not actually at risk of flooding. Plus, it was built in 1960. It's never flooded ever. Even in the 2009, 500-year historic flood event we had here in Atlanta, it didn't flood. It's a moot point, but anyways, you still have to get flood insurance, but it's significantly cheaper if you can do an elevation survey and basically prove that your dwelling is not at risk, but your lot is in it. So flood zones. Another example I want to talk about is power lines. High tensile power lines, for one thing. We looked at a property the other day around here that the agent had advertised as 8.5 acres. Developers, builders, come, and check this out. Well, guess what? The way that the power line, there was high tensile power lines that run across this property, and basically, of the 8 acres, I would say probably 5 to 6 of the 8 acres were all underneath the power lines, which means you can't really do anything with it. You can't build a house under the power lines. You just have to leave it open. It's just open field, open pasture. There's nothing you can do with it. Plus, any potential buyers of this property probably don't want to live near high tensile power lines. A lot of people are kind of freaked out by that. They think about the electromagnetic radiation, all that stuff of these major high tensile power lines running through their property. They probably don't want to buy it. So that makes the land worth less money. Also, to me as a developer, I couldn't do anything with it. I couldn't split the lot up into pieces because the only usable portion of this property already had a house on it. Now we were thinking about demolishing that house and building a bigger house on that property because the house that was there was at one point a mobile home, and then it had been added on to. It didn't look like a mobile home if you looked at it, but reality is it was a mobile home. It had a bunch of additions and wasn't really very well built, and kind of handyman sort of built it, kind of a hack job sort of job. So we would have torn it down and built a new house. Great area, fantastic location, actually just around the corner from, if you guys follow the Atlanta Braves, Chipper Jones just bought a new house around the corner. Those of you who know the Braves from the 90s, Chipper Jones lives like right around the corner from there. So anyways, nice area, but not a very usable lot. And at the price they were asking was crazy. And that agent wasn't from anywhere around here. I don't know how she got the listing, but she obviously is in over her head. She doesn't know what she's talking about because the price that they listed this property at is insane because, like I mentioned, 5 to 6 acres of this 8 acres is totally unusable. There's a lot of factors that can affect the value of the property. Number one, I'm going to one more thing and we'll end the video. I know this is getting long. Topography. How steep is your lot? Can you build on it? Is it buildable, or is it buildable with a decent amount of money? I looked at one a few years ago. A guy said, "Oh, I've got this riverfront lot." I go look at the thing. It was like, no joke, basically like a cliff. Yeah, it was on the river, but I mean, it was like that steep. I kid you not. Like, it was crazy. I was like, I can't do anything with this. Like, if I were to try to build on this, like, it would cost me a fortune in engineering costs and concrete and pylons and helical piles and piers and da-da-da-da. It cost me a fortune to build anything on this property, much less even being able to get a septic system on this property. There's nowhere to put a septic system anywhere. I'd have to buy the lot next door and pump the septic over to the neighbor's house. I'm not going to do that. So totally unusable lot. Completely useless, right? So if you're selling land, figure out what it's worth. Talk to a professional that knows what they're talking about, that can actually accurately assess what your land is worth, and listen to that professional as to what you should list it for. Or if you just want to sell it straight to the professional like myself, we'd be happy to take a look at it and buy it. I buy properties and houses all over the country. Again, specializing in probate and inheritance, but we'll buy anything. And I've got partners throughout the country that I work with. They're strategic partners. I handpick those people. I only choose the people that I want to work with specifically, and they are my go-to person in that specific market. I'm not just working from any average Joe fly-by-night kind of guy. So if you got a property you want to sell, we'd love to take a look at it. Click on the link below in the description. It'll take you to our website. Go to probateresource.com, or you can just pick up the phone and call us. The phone number's there on our website. We'd be happy to talk to you about your property. Thanks for checking out this video. I know it's long, but I hope it helps you. This is kind of a complicated topic. So have a great day. Talk to you later.